Welcome to Community Conversation, where we spotlight the people and projects helping keep our communities informed, connected, and engaged. In part with our sponsors Barney Trucking, Nest Diesel Repair and Performance, and Gallagher Ford, keeping conversations going one episode at a time. Today we're joined by Scott Gavarski and Crystal Newton, the co-hosts of the 775 Alive podcast, a Nevada-based show that dives into big ideas, local perspectives, and thoughtful conversations about the issues shaping life in the 775. Through long-form discussions, 775 Alive explores everything from technology and industry to community identity and the changing media landscape, giving listeners space to slow down, listen, and think. We're excited to talk with Scott and Crystal about what inspired the podcast, how they choose their topics, and the growing role podcasts are playing in civic conversation. Not in a political sense, but in how communities learn, share ideas, and stay engaged with the world around them. Scott, Crystal, welcome to Community Conversation. We're glad to have you here.
Thank you for having us, Megan.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
So, what inspired you both to start the 775 Alive podcast?
From my perspective, I'd been looking at the possibility of doing some sort of podcast and really couldn't come up with anything. And Crystal and I got talking about it one time. And Crystal, if you want to give your perspective on that conversation.
Scott and I, we knew each other for about a year before we started the podcast, and we had a bunch of interesting conversations, and it occurred to us while we were having these conversations that these were the conversations that really needed to be had, not only in the state of Nevada, but the country at large. We're discussing the issues without taking a side. And we were like, this is the conversations that need to get out there. So we decided to record them, and that's how it started.
And can you share the mission or vision behind it?
One of the things we're trying to do is really twofold. So the main one is connecting with urban audiences in the state about the rural perspective. I mean, this is something I do in my own business and in my other activities where there's not a large knowledge base about what actually goes on out here in the rurals. And of course, 775, that's a reference to the area code of everything outside of Clark County in Nevada. Just sharing that dynamic. And the second part of it is also talking to a rural audience that sometimes doesn't have the ability to hear those urban arguments that address these larger issues. You know, we have that tagline, global shenanigans. So we're actually part of that global community, but sometimes we don't think about it.
Every time you tell someone you're from Nevada, they say Vegas. So you have to say, no, I'm not from Vegas. I'm like 6 to 8 hours away from Vegas.
Yeah, and Crystal, what's some of your perspective on that?
During some of the conversations we've had, and we've had a lot, we talked about world history, we talked about a lot of local issues, and we're just finding that there is a huge disconnect between Vegas, where the population of the voters are, and the rest of the state, which is a distinctly different culture. And it's tough to be represented by people who don't know you. And so we really do want to introduce rural ideas to the Las Vegas population, because we're very special. I think we have a lot to offer, and there's just not a lot of knowledge about what we do and how we live.
Hits the nail on the head, because you don't hear a lot of times people thinking you're from Reno. They always think you're from Vegas. So how did your background in rural Nevada life and civic engagement shape the lens of the podcast?
With the 775 Alive, we were trying to tell people that, we are an active and very engaged culture. We have a lot you can learn from, and we really didn't see any representation of that viewpoint. And so when we did make the podcast, there was a lot of directions that we could take it in. But I think the most unique thing is trying to find that voice for rural people. There's such a lack of mainstream content that people are aware of. So we almost had to create a new brand from scratch, because rural doesn't really have a brand. We tried to do that. I don't want to sound arrogant saying we nailed it. We're certainly, it's a work in progress, but I think that was the lens we were trying to craft was how do we brand rural and really let people know who we are, what we stand for, what we do.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting that one of the things that Crystal and I share is we both grow up outside of rural northern Nevada. right? I spent most of my life in Atlanta, although I lived in my early childhood out in rural Ohio. Crystal's from Washington. But we both come here, fell in love with the place, and, have chosen to live here. And one of the things, these conversations we were having as we got to know each other, was a lot of it was like, okay, from some of the urban perspectives, here's some of the stuff we find interesting. Here's some of the stuff that we find stronger. Here's some of the other stuff that maybe we need to, sort of explore more in depth. And that sort of helped inspire what we talk about on the podcast.
There's a lot of people that aren't originally from around here, so they help relate to the podcast. And every once in a while, you'll see a meme that says, "This is my Nevada." No, this is my Nevada. And it's not the casinos, it's all the tumbleweeds.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, that's, you do have that in any state, but it seems to be particularly pronounced here.
I was surprised when you talk to natives, outside of rural, just native Nevadans, there's a humility to the culture, and they're almost surprised to hear when you compliment the culture. And I was surprised to see that, because I really do think Nevada is special in the group of 50 states that is the United States. And the thing that makes it special is the culture. And so that really stuck out to me, that just how little people understood how valuable their culture is here.
I have to agree. We have a very unique culture, and something we always talk about, like Elko, is we're always willing to help each other.
We've talked about that a little bit when we talk about distinctive political cultures. I think nationally, that's one thing that's actually dividing the two sides of the political spectrum right now, is you have a rural political culture that's sort of aimed on getting stuff done, and you have an urban political culture that's really aimed at sort of influencing government, industry, or an agency to come in and fix something. And that's a fundamental dynamic that we see, or at least I see, playing out here more and more in our national politics.
So, was there a particular moment when you knew this podcast just had to happen?
Well, I can speak for myself. When I found out that the Nevada legislature was one seat away from being a supermajority Democratic legislature, that's when, for me, I was like, this has to happen, because we have to do whatever we can. Like, Scott, how can we contribute? Ask myself, how can I contribute? How can I get involved? So for me, the Nevada legislature was the 5-alarm fire. And I was like, I got to do something. And the podcast is my something.
Yeah, when I was thinking about doing podcasts, my background is as a historian. So history podcasts are something that attracts me quite a bit. But I think one thing that came to me is when we were talking about this, we decided just to do a search. What does rural podcasting look like? And it's astounding how few rural podcasts there are. And the ones that exist tend to be very, very focused. Right. It's stuff like agricultural futures, or it's how rural communities can access various types of public service programs and this type of stuff. It wasn't talking about this broader perspective, which is what we were talking about in our conversation. And that, to me, struck me as a gap that needed to be filled.
Or it's about mining. Gotta shout out Mining Minds podcast.
Right. Who we've talked to a couple times. We're trying to set up something with them.
And as we know, your episodes cover a wide range of topics, from AI and industry to community identity and policy. How do you choose which topics will connect with the rural 775 audience?
Oh my gosh. Yes. Do you want to go, Scott, or you want me to?
No, this is a frequent discussion we have.
Oh my gosh, yes.
Yeah. Part of it is we've got some stuff we want to talk about, and we don't 100% agree. I still owe Crystal for agreeing to do one on the census, which is not a topic she likes to talk about much. Part of it is just looking at stuff that's coming up. So a good example of this, we did an episode over the summer over NPR, right? Public radio versus commercial radio like this out in rural communities, because that's what was being talked about when the funding was cut for the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. Some of our recent episodes have happened because we've had people reach out to us and want to reach the audience we're reaching. And, hey, can we get on the show? Yeah, we'll find you a slot, bring it out.
Maybe those billboards are slowly working.
That was Crystal. We have the thing for the billboards.
As rural people, we kind of have to take in the world through media, and a lot of us really try to do our research, but it's hard to tell in this media landscape what's actually real and what's not. And a good example of us kind of looking at what's the topic today and how can we really dig deeper and figure out what the answers are. And we found somebody from the Minneapolis GOP to talk to and ask direct questions and really try to get down to the bottom of it, which I actually think represents rural culture very well, because that's what we do. We typically don't take secondhand knowledge. Most of us are very firsthand, done our research over and over. And so I think we did a good job doing that. But that's typically how we pick them, is we'll try to find out what's relevant and then intertwine that with rural and see how it comes out.
Well, in a way, you can almost think about it when you're talking about media is look at how many things are AI, and you have to really slow down the video at times and watch to realize, oh, wait, that's an AI video.
Yeah, and we saw a lot of that with the Super Bowl ads, de-aging all these actors, some successful, some not. Actually, the AI thing is something that came out of anywhere. This was an issue that Crystal had a lot of concern about, and all of a sudden we've done what, 3 or 4 episodes on AI and how vibrant AI actually is in rural communities. I mean, that was sort of surprising, was how many people were interested in this AI issue.
So many episodes highlight voices from around Nevada, including experts, locals, and leaders. What role do you see storytelling playing in amplifying community perspectives?
Oh, it's the biggest role, isn't it, Scott?
Yeah, and Crystal's actually this more on the storytelling side, but I will say rural communities, this is how we communicate, is that we like to tell stories. That's what we do. It's sort of odd sometimes because I myself am actually more of a data person, and Crystal has to keep nudging me, okay, we can't spend 15 minutes digging into the data. And I'm like, that's what I want to do.
Crystal's like, hold on, not everyone likes the data.
It's the correct thing to do. I try to reassure him. I'm like, I'm not saying it's the wrong thing, but when it does come to communication in this modern day business and marketing and cultural environment, it's really come down to the narrative and which narrative you align with. And to go back to that point of what's the lens on this podcast, it's, well, how does the national news, national issues, state issues, global issues, how does that look through the rural lens? And it's important that rurals have a narrative that they can cling to, because the national narratives are really, you can't really cling to it, and rurals do have their own narrative. So I really feel like it's important to embed the data into a narrative that is consistent. But Scott is so great with data, and I just, I wish the American public had the attention span, because I listen to them for hours, but you have to kind of get it down to a narrative that's consumable.
Yeah, and I think that's a good way of putting that, is this idea of consumability. I think we're in an odd dynamic right now with media. One of the things is we've pushed so hard for shorter attention spans, but that seemed to leave a gap. If I could go one example, of course, we have a YouTube channel, like most podcasts do. And one of the things is, for the longest time, YouTube was pushing these shorts, right? These little 15, 20-minute teaser or 20-second teasers. Here over the last 6 months, they've actually been gradually bumping that up, because people now want 3, 4, 5, 6 minutes to understand what it is they're seeing. That's an interesting balancing act to give both depth and that sort of success that comes with, hearing a story played out to conclusion.
We will be back with 775, a live podcast, after this commercial break. Community Conversation is sponsored by Barney Trucking, Gallagher Ford, and Neff's Diesel Repair and Performance. We are back on Community Conversation with 775, a live podcast. Thank you to our sponsors, Barney Trucking, Gallagher Ford, and Neff's Diesel Repair and Performance. So how do you balance topics that matter locally, like rural identity or mining, with broader national or global issues?
From the rural perspective, when I do thinking about how to construct this podcast and the content, what I do know is that rural people are extraordinarily well educated, and they're very social. They're constantly taking the information they learn and they're bouncing it off of other people. And that process kind of plays out until they get some sort of common logic. So I'm never too concerned about the rural side of our audience, but I'm more concerned with the people who don't know the rural people how our content is coming across to them, if it's representing the rural perspective. And it's more, I'm trying to engineer something that can bring people to understanding rural people.
Yeah, and building on that, in that rural perspective, I think there's also a responsibility to connect the rurals to these larger stories we see, the big picture. Of course, something with mining is a little easier, right? Because gold prices, which are skyrocketing right now, are tied very much to a destabilized global economy and situation. But at the same time, even some of the stuff we tend not to connect. NPR, right? One of the constant takes with the NPR discussions back last summer in the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, well, rural communities are going to lose their radio. And, Nevada really doesn't have a lot of rural public radio stations. Most of it's commercial, like GlobalOne Media. And that's a perspective. Here's a big global debate that's just misrepresenting what's actually going on here on the ground.
There are certain people who are listening, they might have been experienced like with coal mining if they're on the East Coast, or it's one of those things where you think of Nevada, a lot of people think of like the cowboy poetry. We know we have the huge event here in Elko, so they are used to certain things. So it's connecting everyone together with a similar idea.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And so can you share a conversation you've had on the podcast that surprised you or changed your perspective?
I think I'm going to go with the low-hanging fruit. We just recently did an episode with Adrienne Marsh, who is a Democratic, I wouldn't say she's a Democratic strategist. She's more the person that collects the data for the strategist. Listening to her break down the Republican side and really try to understand what motivates us and how to go about delivering this information to the Democratic Party. I suppose I guessed some of that was the process, but just listening to the Democrats try to research us and study us and dissect us and try to figure out how to win us over, that was really eye-opening to me, I think. And it was an interesting conversation because the one thing that was left out of the conversation was, what do Republicans want, or what do rural Republicans want? The conversation was, how do we get them? And so it was an interesting peeling back of what's going on in this country and how the parties are going after each other, trying to win. Mm-hmm. That was really different for me. What would you, Scott, was that one interesting to you?
Oh, yeah.
Or was there another one that you're thinking of?
Well, that one was interesting. For me, I'd probably say the one that was most surprising is we were down in Vegas doing some promotions into last fall, and we sat down with Erica Neely, who's running for 89 Nevada Assembly down there. But she's very active in the Republican, Hispanic, and Latino community, does a lot of stuff. And so we sat down with her with a conversation because that's something that, again, dominates sort of national media discussions, but in rurals, it's a much harder issue for us to get our hands on sometimes. And one of the things Erica said in considering first-generation immigrant who support continued immigration was her perspective that in some ways this is actually undermining the success of their children, because that cheaper workforce is going to run them out of jobs. And I think on camera, that was probably a face where I almost gasped. I just never had heard that perspective. That was really shocking when she brought that out.
As we know, podcasts have become a platform for deep conversation, not just headlines or sound bites. But in your view, what role do podcasts play today in strengthening civic understanding?
I would say one of the big things they do is actually provide a broader range of perspectives. Some good, some bad. That's really not the point. But one of the things I've seen is the media landscape has changed. The great media enterprises of the past, right? When you think about Water Cronkite and the papers, most of those come out of the environment where there's actually, most towns have 2 newspapers, right? If you look back in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s. And that structured a lot of the reporting, not so much that they had to come together and present a unified voice, which I think is a misconception a lot of people had. They were just as partisan back then as we are now. The difference was in that environment where you have a paper on the other side of town that might have a different political perspective, you have to actually have your data backed up, right? Your argument has to be sound because the guy on the other side of town is going to call you out on it. And that's something I think we've lost, but we're actually in the process of rediscovering with podcast.
Well, and I love how you brought up newspapers. I love to learn a lot about history of serial killers because I always wanted to become almost like a psychologist. So I used to watch that. But look at how the Zodiac killer used to send clippings of a newspaper. So I mean, nowadays we're like, where is a newspaper?
Yeah, and I was just really hoping you weren't going to say you were going to become a serial killer.
No,
we'd be having a different conversation. No, I think that very much is true. And as Crystal was saying earlier, one of the things we have is it's so easy now to actually lock out that other side. One of my favorite hobbies is watching the great variety shows we used to have in the 60s, right? Not just Ed Sullivan, but Hollywood Palace and all these others. And what was so interesting is if you look at the structure of those programs, there's usually one sort of classical act. There is an act that really is coming out of the country dynamic, and then there's an act for the kids, which is the hot rock band. But these are all put on the same show because they're trying to reach 3 different audiences. So you actually had a broader perspective simply because they needed to appeal to a broader audience. That is what's missing, I think, in a lot of the modern media landscape.
Right. I mean, they had the dating game too back then.
Well, we still have the dating game. It's just now it's an hour and a half, 2 hours, and heavily advertised, right?
Right. So, I mean, media's always changed and it's still changing. And then you think about podcasts. Now you can get it on Spotify and Apple. There's a lot of ways to easily get a podcast. So what makes podcasting particularly effective for talking about community issues compared to traditional news?
I mean, it's got a lot of different characteristics, and it's still a market that's developing. So I do a lot of emerging market work in business consulting, and it takes a while for a market to really develop to where we can apply rules and start to understand it. But I did want to go back to what Scott was saying because I think he makes a very good point. And I think podcasting could emerge and is with podcasts like the Joe Rogan Experience and a few others they have tons of followers. You do have the opportunity that if the established media goes a little too wayward, that there is an alternate avenue where you can find out information. So in some ways, I think the podcast will almost be a checks and balances on the media. And the further that people get along the pathway of not believing in media, I think they'll turn to podcasts more and more. It's really hard. We've had this conversation a lot, actually, Scott and I, about where is this going and are people actually going to get information from podcasts exclusively? Is the national media going to go away? It's really difficult to say. And I know this is your interview of us, Megan, but I always want to ask the question back to you. How do you feel as a radio station, like a radio program? All of us are kind of trying to guess where this is going to go. But I don't know. What do you think, Scott?
Yeah, I think one of the things to this question about whether podcasts play and talking about local issues versus larger ones is simply the issue of scale. One of the things we've had contributed to media consolidation, contributed to the cost of local newspaper printing, is that there's a lot of stuff that gets sidestepped because it's simply cheaper or easier to draw off the large picture and not really talk about what's going on locally. So I think there really is a role of podcast in that. I think it's also interesting, getting back to Crystal's point about whether podcasts are going to evolve into something much more respected, is I think one of the issues we see that I come back to is actually, of all things, Rolling Stone magazine. This starts out as a very fringe magazine in the late 60s, early 70s, devoted to an upcoming hobby scene in the rock industry. Then they hire Hunter S. Thompson, and now it's sort of considered an aspect of mainstream media. Podcasting, with its ability to do that tight focus, but still have that capacity to expand out to address these bigger issues, I think has a very similar or potential for a very similar trajectory.
Well, and I have to go back to what Crystal said about like here on the radio is there's always ways to evolve, like a podcast or radio. I remember growing up watching Ann Curry and Katie Couric, and I always wanted to become a newscaster. I was obsessed with Teen Kids News, and now I'm doing radio. And it's in a way we're radio, but also podcast because we do upload online. So there's always ways to evolve and grow and find your audience.
Yeah, and I think that's also an advantage podcasting has over some more traditional media, which is locked in to time schedules. There's a hilarious ad about demeaning traditional newspapers where the guy's like, well, I want my news delivered 2 days late and wrapped up like a burrito. It's humorous. It takes down traditional media. But it's still a very interesting sort of look at the reality that, when we upload a podcast, over the week, people can download it. Right. And that's a different dynamic where in some ways these conversations have a permanence that modern media might not be able actually to match.
We will be back with 775, a live podcast after this commercial break. Community Conversation is sponsored by Barney Trucking, Gallagher Ford, and Neff's Diesel Repair and Performance. We are back on Community Conversation with 775, a live podcast. Thank you to our sponsors, Barney Trucking, Gallagher Ford, and Neff's Diesel Repair and Performance. So how do you decide when it's appropriate to include topics that touch on civic processes like electronics, public policy, or local government without aligning with any particular political stance?
I guess one of the things, if you haven't guessed, is, outside the podcast, we're both heavily active in local Republican circles. So, we do have a perspective, and we're not shy about that. So when we get people like Adrian Marsh or Adam Swart, who's an independent, we're upfront, hey, we're Republicans, but we want to have this conversation. Part of at least my perspective is including some of this stuff depends on what's topical at any given time. And that just comes up, and you have to deal with the issues as they come up, regardless of how uncomfortable they are. Right. And we get our share of negative feedback. This Minneapolis issue that we did with Sean Holster and a different perspective on what's going on up there. We got a good bit of feedback on that, but, if we shied away from it and just said, okay, well, just, that's not something we want to talk about, for a lot of our listeners, that would have been a perspective that was missing.
For me, I really adamantly believe that the best function of a society is if both sides are really being represented. So I don't come at this from like a team player standpoint. I am staunchly conservative. I am a registered Republican, but I recognize the value in other perspectives and the other parties. And I do recognize that you need everybody being represented in society for all of us to have a good outcome. And so for me, it's not about my side winning. It's about everybody getting a chance to talk and us being able to understand every perspective. And I think that's what forms a good society. So I'm always willing to talk to the other side and sincerely listen. I don't just listen as a token. I sincerely hear them out.
Yeah, and I would agree with that I don't think podcasts bear any different responsibility. It's certainly not moral responsibility than any other discussion. For instance, that we're talking about complex issues that aren't just single-sided. So the best discussion, whether it be on a podcast, whether it be with friends over coffee, whether it be within public forums, is really to dig in and deal with that complexity. That's one of the things I think that podcasts, particularly ours, where we can go on 30 minutes, 40 minutes, as opposed to at most a 5-minute segment like I used to do when get invited on television shows. It's a much better way to sort of engage with that civic process by really taking the time to dig into this stuff.
What responsibility do podcasters have in helping listeners understand complex issues like digital democracy or public media, rather than simply presenting opposing viewpoints?
I think there is an issue that sometimes we misunderstand what the responsibility is that media has. And part of that is most of the media that we have experience with for decades has been radio and television, which are finite resources, right? So stuff like the fairness doctrine, stuff such as equal airtime, for opposing candidates. The question is that if you interview a candidate, does that become an in-kind contribution? That's not based on a moral responsibility to present both sides of the view. It's the fact that you have a public regulation of a finite resource. That doesn't exist in podcasting. While I think there is a role as a member of an educated public to present both sides of an issue, I think one of the struggles that the podcast industry has right now is if somebody doesn't like what you're saying, it's too easy to go somewhere else. My hope is that providing these sort of longer form discussions, we can actually engage people on both sides and fulfill that function.
I would say that we do actually take quite a few steps and efforts between Scott and I to try not to lead people. Explaining issues, there's so much about explaining issues that can be subjective. So I think we really make an effort to focus on helping people ask the right questions. And I think I should only speak for myself here, but I do think it's more important to our listener to know how to ask the right questions than for me to explain much to them in terms of an answer.
And I have to ask, so what's the most memorable response you've received from a listener, either positive, challenging, or thought-provoking?
I do. I really did like the Erica Neely interview that you referenced earlier, Scott. She was incredible. Just talking about the Hispanic community. And my takeaway that was a little bit different from that one was that I assumed that the entire Hispanic community would be anti-ICE, and that is not the case. In fact, that community is distinctly split between those who don't like ICE and those who really support what ICE is doing. And I really didn't think there would be anybody in that community that would support ICE. And when she laid out the reasons why, really did. That was thought-provoking to me. I think I reflected on ignorant my thought was, and I reflected on the Hispanic community in a different way and really trying to understand where they're coming from. That really provoked a lot of thought.
Yeah, I think for me, do a little shout out. There's some good friends of ours down in Las Vegas have a radio show called Talk with a Conservative, right? The Brinkleys, Patricia and Garland. Mm-hmm. And they invited us down in early December to be on their radio show to talk about some of these issues. And, so we went down there. That was live radio. And we did the thing. And at least for me, I sort of walked away thinking, hey, I probably didn't perform my best, right? It takes a while to get into a rhythm in different format. Well, then the next day, Crystal and I go to, it was the Nevada Republican Club luncheon. And the number of people in Las Vegas who come up to us and said, wow, we really appreciated that show. We have never heard people from the rurals talk about what's the rural experiences with homelessness. How are the demographics in the rurals working? So what we thought I thought was a bad show because I wasn't really felt prepared. They were just in wonder because they've never heard that voice, which really told me we're onto something.
Do you ever invite listener feedback or topic suggestions, and how does that shape future episodes?
Well,
I invite all the positive comments, and I tell everyone to send the negative comments to Scott.
Right. That's true. Yeah, we
it is true.
we would really invite people to give us some suggestions. One of the things is we have an audience, I think, that's not used to hearing rural communities talk about some of these issues. Going back to the Sean Holster issue, why are two people from rural Nevada Crystal picked up the phone and tried to get hold of somebody from the Minneapolis GOP to see what they thought going on the ground. That sort of is surprising to a lot of people. And I think the more we're able to get out there and get these issues before the public, we'll invite all that feedback. Who do you think we should be talking to? Right? Because this is something we want to explore more.
What's a topic you haven't covered yet but feel is important for rural communities to explore together?
Mine would be, I think there is a lack of understanding in the rural communities, just China and our relationship with China and how much they impact our supply chain and our policies and our financial markets. I think if there is one thing that seems to be flying under the radar, that would be it for me. I don't know. What about you, Scott?
Well, one of the ones we've been constantly talking about, and I think we're going to have to do it sooner or later once we figure out how, is have a discussion about water. Huge in rural communities, of course. Crystal, part of her business is dealing with rural water supplies. But it's also going to be a big issue. We've got the debates going on as we're recording this now about the Colorado River Compact and where that's going to change. But water tends to be that issue. Not only does it gets both sides fired up, right? That old thing, whiskey's for drinking, water's for fighting, that we often say out here in rural Nevada. But it's also an issue that tends to be very technical. And, even when we have 45 minutes to talk about it, boy, that's a lot of data to get across to somebody. So as soon as we can figure out a way to sort of get a hook into that, we're going to be looking at it.
Well, and water is always a huge one, especially right now. Like California is no longer in a drought, but we've had kind of a dry winter. So it definitely is always a topic.
Yep.
That's the big conversation right now in the agricultural community. And now that I think about it, Scott, that we see a couple farms every year because, the water rights are so valuable and they'll never make as much money if they sell the farms than if they stay farming. And, that's really important to Nevada's culture. If we sell these farms one at a time, those water rights never come back to ag. And so there's so much that touches. So that's going to be a tough one for us to try to construct a coherent hour on.
Which is why we haven't done it yet.
Soon, though.
Right. We're intimidated. It's the Goliath of topics.
So as the media continues to evolve with podcasts, video platforms, social media, and more, how do you see 775 Alive adapting or growing?
Yeah, one of the hot topics I think that's going on for all podcasts and social media generally is a debate whether engagement matters or building community. We're caught up in that as well, right? So we can sit there, we can look at how many downloads we have, we can look at likes. But one of the funniest things is, as most people figured out on social media, you don't get a lot of likes. People aren't willing to engage. But then going to an event or just talking to people on the street, like, oh yeah, I really heard your last episode, right? It's like, holy smoke. I was just at, of course, Ro Khanna, the Democratic congressman from California, was just here for Cowboy Poetry, and I got invited to a breakfast event with him, and I was talking to a young gentleman next to me, and I said, yeah, I do that 775 Alive podcast, and he goes, oh yeah, I listen to you. I never agree with anything you say, but I listen to you. And that, I think, explains this engagement issue. And in fact, I've reached out to him and some of, he's a union member. So, as soon as they get back to me, we're probably going to do an episode on unions in the rurals. But that's the type of stuff that I think we're all struggling with right now.
And for me, something I had envisioned from the beginning was eventually getting to a place where we could sit down with 4, 5, 6, 7 people that represent different types of ideas and backgrounds and parties and really host community conversations. That's something we really haven't done yet that we'd like to do. And again, we just want to set an example of what it's like to have a civil conversation with people who don't necessarily agree with you. And I think that's something that Scott and I do very well. We actually enjoy talking to people, and we're not necessarily looking to be right all the time. So to get that into an episode, I think would be great.
I like the vision.
Oh, thanks.
What advice would you give to someone looking to start a podcast focused on community issues and civic engagement without making it overly political?
Well, my advice would be just talk to everybody. I tend to be much less worried about making it overtly political per se. I mean, like I said, looking back through media history, we've never had a totally neutral media, right? We have a media that's been constrained because somebody else would be willing to call them out on the other side of town. But the big thing I think that we need for civics right now is just for people to talk to each other and really dig into some of these issues and see where they can find some stuff that they agree with and agree on, and then move from there.
And I would say from the artistic perspective and the business perspective, there's so much good content out there, and it's all templated in the same way that if you have that impulse to create a podcast, you think you have a great idea, do some real work in identifying who you are and what your voice is, and whatever you do, don't stray from that, because that's the one unique brand you have, is your unique perspective. So I just see so many people get into this, and then they start to talk like other people and parrot what they're hearing. And like, we have enough of this content already. I would rather see somebody be authentically them and have a train wreck of an episode and work towards something more refined. But people's instinct to try to sound and look like everyone else, it's too much. Just give us your authentic self.
I love it. Be authentically you and use your voice. Before we wrap up, anything else you would like to add that we may not have covered or said?
Well, outside the obvious, please listen to us. I think this has been really good. I appreciate the opportunity to get out here and talk about these issues that normally we're just discussing over dinner or while we're trying to edit together an episode.
I'd like to take this time to just reiterate that Nevada is 1 seat away from the supermajority legislature. And if you want a balanced state, you have to get to the polls this November.
Well, Scott and Crystal, thank you both for joining us today and for the work you're doing through this 775 Alive podcast. What really stands out is how podcasting creates space for deeper conversation where people can hear different perspectives, understand complex topics, and feel more connected to what's happening in their own communities, especially right now. That kind of thoughtful dialogue matters.
So thank you for having us. As I like to close out our shows, we'll see you around the 775.
See you around the 775. If you'd like to check out their conversations, you can find 775 Alive online at 775alive.com and on social platforms, including video episodes on YouTube. And they encourage you to listen, explore, and be part of the discussion. Thanks for tuning in to Community Conversation, proudly sponsored by Barney Trucking, Gallagher Ford, and Neff's Diesel Repair and Performance. If you want to be my next guest, call me at 775-777-1196. Replay today's episode or past episodes anytime on elkoconversation.com. I'm Megan Ray, and we'll see you next time as we continue highlighting the voices helping shape our community.